Good evening, my little pips. Welcome, welcome, welcome. How are you all doing today? Did you have a good day? Are you looking forward to today's reading? Tonight we are going back to the dark Middle Ages. Will we be reading about torture techniques and witch burnings? Let's get comfy and find out, okay? The Middle Ages. By the time of the Middle Ages, the stories by which the peoples of Europe sought to understand and interpret their lives had moved out of the realm of myth and become part of folklore and legend. The population of the continent was by then firmly Christian, and the tales in favor at the time dealt not with gods and spirits, but rather with heroes, villains, and the abuses of feudal power. Many of the narratives revolved around famed champions of the past. One such was Charlemagne, creator and first ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, who became the central figure in the cycle of epics concerned with the daring deeds of the knights of his court. This Carolingian meta of France paralleled the Arthurian meta of Britain, providing role models for aspirant warriors. Elaborated by Italian romancers, the cycle was given a fantastic twist in the Orlando epics, recounting the adventures of Charlemagne's paladin Roland in pursuit of honor and love. The story of Bradamante and Ruggiero captures the playful inventiveness of Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, involving as it does enchanters, magical illusions, spellbound lovers, and even a hippogriff, the poet's own creation, a blend of griffin and horse. The Spanish equivalents of the Charlemagne stories turned on Alcide. Like his Frankish counterpart, he too had some basis in reality, in his case in the figure of the 11th century warlord Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, who played a prominent role in the struggle between Christian and Moorish forces on the Iberian Peninsula. While the real Cid was a pragmatist, happily allying with the Moors when it served his purpose, the legendary figure became a paragon of the Christian virtues, as the story of his charitable treatment of a leper shows. Other romancers looked back further to antiquity and the career of the Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great. Initially inspired by classical accounts of his life, the medieval Alexander epics were spiced up with travelers' tales brought back from the east by the Crusaders, including accounts of giant scorpions and prophetic talking trees. Many stories stood on their own, appealing to an audience deeply versed in the codes of chivalry and romance. Some existed in a dream world of poetic reverie, like the legend of Thomas the Rhymer, which drew on Celtic notions of fairyland as a subterranean realm ruled over by a beautiful princess with a roving eye for human lovers. Others, like the Lohengrin story, later turned into an opera by Richard Wagner, had a Superman-like element of wish fulfillment, with a swan-born knight arriving magically to answer the call of a damsel in distress. A folktale that Boccaccio retold in the Decameron told of the struggle of a chaste wife accused wrongly of infidelity, who was vindicated only after a sequence of improbable adventures that took her to Egypt and the Muslim Sultan's court. The combating of injustice was in fact a favored theme across many lands throughout the Middle Ages. Often the initial wrong sprang from an abuse of feudal power. One group of stories highlighted the plight of noblemen dispossessed of lands that rightly belonged to them. This subject underlay the legends of White Edric, inspired by the misfortunes of a real-life Saxon lord who lost his estate following the Norman conquest of Britain. Similar concerns also informed the tragedy of Raoul de Cambrai, incorporated into one of the Charlemagne epics, whose only redress lay in inflicting similar wrong on another rightful heir. The injured parties in the familiar story of Lady Godiva were the people of Coventry, subjected to extortionate taxes by the lady's own husband. Even better known was the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, who took a terrible revenge on the burghers of the German town and cheated of his promised reward for services as a rodent remover. I guess we won't be reading about witch burnings tonight, but the tales we will hear about still sound very interesting. It's fascinating that we now go away from a collective of gods and learn more about the lives of real people. Well, as real as I believe they are real, right? Let's start with our first tale of tonight. The Tragedy of Raoul de Cambrai. The tale of a French knight, Raoul de Cambrai, dispossessed as a child of his inheritance by Carlemagne's son King Louis I, is one of the best-known episodes in the colorful late 12th century French epic The Four Sons of Aymon. The Count de Cambrai died while his wife Alais was pregnant with the son Raoul. King Louis tried to force Alais to marry Guibert le Manco, but she refused. The furious Louis then seized Raoul's inheritance and gave it to Gabrielle in perpetuity. Raoul grew up to be a skilled knight and favored member of court, but one day 2 young brothers were killed while under his supervision. Although Raoul was not to blame, he was too proud to explain, and the boy's father, Arnaud de Douai, declared undying enmity. Raoul pressed Louis to restore his inheritance, but the king refused, offering him instead the lands of the next knight to die. Raoul accepted these terms, though they were highly unchivalrous. Robert de Vermandois soon died, leaving 4 adult sons, one of them the father of Raoul's squire, Bernier. Raoul demanded that Louis keep his promise, and the king assented, but said that Raoul would have to win the land in battle. Both Bernier and Alais tried to dissuade Raoul from rendering unto another the wrong he had suffered himself. He would not listen, and after a fierce quarrel with his mother, the proud Raoul rode fully armed into the Vermandois territories. Bernier himself came to blows with Raoul, but fled, hurt, to his father's camp. Then Raoul met his sworn enemy, Arnaud de Douai, alongside Bernier in battle. As the three fought, Raoul declared that God himself could not save Arnaud, a blasphemy that sealed his fate. Raoul was killed by Bernier and his body borne sorrowfully home. Our first day starts out with a sad life. Poor Raoul did nothing wrong. He just got tossed around by fate and by his king overlord. Some humans really will live a pitiful life. Doesn't matter how much they try to change it. But please, don't think that also applies to you, okay? This is just a tale. You can always change your destiny. Our next myth is about a love story. Bradamante and Ruggiero. In Orlando Furioso, by Lodovico Ariosto, the chaste warrior maiden Bradamante, who rode as the Virgin Knight, clad in white armor, won the heart of the pagan champion Ruggiero. But there were many twists and turns in the romance. Ruggiero was said to be descended from Hector of Troy, nursed in infancy by a lioness. He was a ward of the magician Atlas, who kept him away from harm because a prophecy had foretold his early death. Bradamante freed Ruggiero from Atlas's castle, which was spun from sparks, only for Atlas to sweep the hero away once more on a hippogriff, a winged horse with a griffin's head. He was then freed again by another knight and travelled far and wide, but Atlas always worked to bring him back to safety. One enchanted day, deep in the forest glade, Ruggiero encountered a knight and the giant locked in single combat. The giant downed and prepared to dispatch his opponent, but just then the knight's helmet came loose, and Ruggiero saw that the fallen champion was none other than his beloved Bradamante. As he leaped forward to save her, the giant swept her up and ran deeper into the forest with the knight over his shoulder, leading Ruggiero to an enchanted castle. There he searched for her, but without success, for Atlas had had his way once more. Both the maiden in likeness of Bradamante and the castle itself he had created by his magic. The time came when the real Bradamante rode by the same glade, and Atlas used the phantom in the form of Ruggiero to lure the virgin champion into his lair. She too searched vainly for her beloved. When they were later freed from the spell, Bradamante and Ruggiero embraced passionately. The pagan knight converted to the Christian faith to win her hand. Eventually, the two were wed at Charlemagne's court. Splendid pavilions were raised and the fields decorated with garlands. I really like how the roles are kinda reversed here. Ruggiero, by the way, that name is really hard to say for me, is the damsel in distress, getting saved twice from his overprotective guardian Atlas. A very based magician, just saying. He even seems to have similar magic to mine. It's nice though that the two lovers got the happy ending. I just hope the magician wasn't killed for that happy ending. Our next story is about the generous and good-hearted knight. Alcid and the Leaper. Preserved in medieval Spanish ballads and chronicles, the legend of Alcid was based on the life of the 11th century nobleman Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. Alcid's generosity toward a roadside beggar is one of many episodes celebrating Don Rodrigo's piety and knightly virtue. The great Alcid rode at the head of a company of 20 knights to pay his respects at the shrine of James, Spain's national saint, at Santiago de Compostela. When he came upon a leper in the road, calling in a frail voice for Christian charity, Alcid stopped his horse, dismounted, and helped the leper to his feet. He lifted the man into the saddle, then climbed up himself and rode on with the leper sharing his mount. Later they stopped for the night at an inn. Don Rodrigo insisted that the leper be admitted, and even brought him to his own table to eat. As the candles were lit, at the end of the day, Don Rodrigo led the leper into the chamber he himself had been allocated, and there allowed him to share his bed. In the darkest hour of night, the Christian warrior woke with a start, feeling a cold breath between his shoulders. He leapt from his bed and called for a light. When the shadows were banished, neither he nor the manservant could see the leper anywhere in the chamber. Then the great champion fell to his knees, for he saw an apparition blazing with the light of heaven. The ghost declared itself to be Lazarus, the corpse raised from the dead by Christ himself. He, Lazarus, had taken the form of the leper whose suffering Alcid had relieved the previous day. Then he foretold a wonderful future for the warrior, an honorable death, and welcome into paradise. The vision faded, and for the rest of the night, Don Rodrigo remained on his knees, praising the Virgin Mary and God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Based and red pilled. I wonder though, what would have happened if Alcid didn't go full on Samaritan and just gave the sick person some coins or food and left him on the side of the street? Would his future be different then? Our next move is a story about journeys throughout the world. Alexander's letters to Aristotle. The exploits of the 4th century BCE Macedonian general Alexander the Great are the basis of a series of Romance narratives that were familiar in medieval Europe. The more exotic stories take the form of letters written by Alexander to his tutor Aristotle. One of Alexander's missives describes how, on a visit to an untamed part of the world, the general's army saw a great city that seemed to float in the air. It was constructed on top of reeds that thronged a river bank. The river water tasted foul, and some of the men who tried to bathe there were eaten by reptiles. Later, when they were thirsty, after a long march, they came across a lake with sweet waters and camped beside it. That night, horned snakes and scorpions the length of a man's forearm emerged from the ground and attacked the soldiers. Fierce beasts came to drink at the lake, such as foul-breathed animals with the faces of women, but the jaws and fangs of dogs. On another campaign in India, Alexander was shown a sacred garden filled with talking trees. They stood at the center of the garden, surrounded by a hedge. One sacred to a sun god named Mithra spoke 3 times each day, at dawn, noon, and dusk. Another, the tree of a moon god called Mayusa, spoke twice, at midnight and in the early morning. At sunset, Alexander heard words emerge from the first tree in the local language, and Alexander had to pester a priest to reveal what the oracle had said. It had warned Alexander that he would soon be killed by his own men. Later that night, he returned to the garden close to the time when the moon tree was due to pronounce, and again he was not disappointed. A deep voice sounded from the timber, revealing more dread news. Great Alexander would die at Babylon, far from home. In truth, the god spoke wisely, for he was to face a mutiny that would force him to retreat from India. And in 323 BCE, at Babylon on the Euphrates, Alexander would die, of fever rather than treachery. Would you like to be one of the men of Alexander, traveling around the world, seeing all these places, even if they are cursed sometimes? When Alexander forced the priest to translate what one of the trees said, the priest said that Alexander will die from treachery of his own men. But in the end, he actually died from a fever. So I'm asking myself, if the priest just said something so Alexander would leave him alone. Oh well, our next tale is about a failed romance and a knight from the Holy Lands. The mysterious Swan Knight. On his deathbed, the Duke of Brabant left his daughter Else in the care of a much-feared knight called Frederick, who wished to marry her. She refused, but Frederick got permission from the emperor to win her by right of combat, against any champion she chose. Hard as she tried, Else could not find anyone prepared to fight Frederick. However, a predicament started a magic bell ringing in the blessed land of the Holy Grail, the cup used to offer the first communion at the Last Supper. The sound of the bell summoned Lohengrin, the son of the Grail's guardian, to aid her. Lohengrin was about to mount his horse and set off when he saw a swan on the river, pulling a shallow boat, and he realized that it had come for him. In Brabant, the day for the contest arrived, and, without a challenger, Frederick was about to claim Else, whereupon the swan-drawn boat pulled up to the riverbank, with the sleeping Lohengrin inside. Waking, he leaped onto the shore and the swan swam off. Lohengrin then fought and killed Frederick, and Else offered herself and her lands to him. He accepted, but only if she agreed never to ask where he came from. They lived happily for several years, but after Lohengrin broke a knight's arm in a tournament, the man's wife began to question his past. When Else heard this, she cried every night, until at last she asked Lohengrin where he was from. He told her, But at dawn the next day, the swan came for him, and he departed. I don't get why Elsa was crying that her husband drew broke an arm of another contestant in the tournament. Accidents happen, no? Especially if the tournament is combat-based. And why is it so important to know where he was from after several years of being married to him? In the end, it doesn't really matter, right? Maybe there are more details in the story though, that the book doesn't tell us. Anyways, our next myth is about a man that gets willingly abducted by a beautiful woman. True Thomas of Ercedone. Thomas the Rhymer, or True Thomas as he is also known, was a famous character from Scottish folklore, said to have been based on the historical Thomas Learmont, a 13th century laird. It was said that an elf queen granted him the gift of always telling the truth. Thomas was resting on the banks of a ravine when he saw a woman riding toward him. She was so lovely that, when she came near, he asked if she were the Queen of Heaven. No, she answered, I am the Queen of Elfland. She then explained that she had come to take Thomas to live with her for 7 years, and that if he kissed her, he would be under her spell. Thomas promptly climbed onto the back of her horse. The pair flew like the wind until they came to a fragrant garden. Thomas wanted to eat some of its fruit, but the elf queen warned him that it contained the plagues of all humankind. She gave him bread and wine, and after he had eaten, she pointed out the 3 paths that led from the garden. The first one, winding through prickly briars, was the path of righteousness. The second, running through a lily field, was the way of wickedness. The third led to Elfland. But before they took it, the queen warned Thomas not to say a word while in her country, or he would not get back to his own land. They traveled for 40 days and nights, before finally they reached the elf queen's garden. There she gave Thomas an apple, which, once eaten, would prevent him from ever telling a lie when he went back home. Thomas ended up staying in Elfland for 7 years. When he returned home, he won a reputation as a great prophet, for all the predictions he made came true. You know how you teach children not to go with strangers, but it just takes a beautiful woman to make a man go with a stranger. Be honest. Would you go with a beautiful woman even if you don't know her? That's a recipe for losing your kidneys, honestly. Imagine not talking for 7 years though. Don't you also unlearn how to speak after a while? And telling the truth all the time also sounds more like a curse than a blessing sometimes. Would you have spoken to stay forever with the Queen of Elfland? I wonder actually if he would have stayed with her, if he would have, and not in a prison or something. Interesting to maybe know is that the number 7 had a big role in medieval times. It stood for completeness, perfection, the universe, and had several meanings in Christianity as well, like the 7-day creation of the world, the 7 sins and 7 virtues. My source is Google now, so keep that in mind, maybe it's not all accurate. Our next tale is about a knight that wants to be the perfect man for his sweetheart. The Worth of Hind Horn. While there were medieval stories about love across class boundaries, most romance occurred between social equals. Birth status notwithstanding, in a number of tales, a knight would go on a quest in pursuit of glory, so that he might deserve his beloved when he returned. Although he was of noble birth, Hind Horn was not rich and worked as a servant at the court of the king. One day he was spotted by the king's daughter, who immediately fell in love with him. She begged him to marry her, but he protested, that he was not wealthy enough to marry a princess and would only agree if her father knighted him first. The girl persuaded her father, and as soon as Hind was a knight, she pestered him again to marry her. This time, though, he insisted that he must first prove himself in combat before he could be deemed worthy of her. Before he departed, the princess gave him a special ring. If it ever lost its gleam, she warned, he would have lost her to another man. For 7 years he traveled the 4 countries, often checking the ring, until one day he noticed that it had become tarnished. Returning home swiftly, he met a beggar who told him that the princess had been married for 9 days, but she was refusing to go to her husband's bed until she heard news of Hind Horn. Hearing this, Hind swapped his clothes for the rags belonging to the beggar and went promptly to the palace where the couple lived. At the gate, he asked for a drink served by the bride's own hand. The princess brought him a goblet, and after draining it, he slipped the ring inside. She asked who had given him the ring, and he replied that she had, long ago. At that, the princess recognized him and left her husband to run away with Hind Horn. This tale teaches us that we are sometimes too strict with ourselves, that we shouldn't be blinded by our own perfectionism, and that we shouldn't decide what makes us attractive or worthy of others, because sometimes our brain likes to bamboozle us. The princess decided by herself that Hind was worthy of her by not trusting her and her judgment, and also misjudging himself. He wasted 7 years that he could have spent with his sweetheart already, while becoming the perfect knight on the side, if he still wanted to do that. So please, my little Pip, remember this tale, okay, if you ever doubt yourself. Our next myth is about the life of a nobleman. Tales of White Edric. The Saxon resistance to the Norman conquest spawned legends across England, notably the Fenn saga of Hereward the Wake. On the Welsh border, another dispossessed nobleman took up arms against the invaders, winning a lasting place in local folklore by his deeds. In real life, Edric was a Saxon nobleman who rose in revolt against the Normans to defend his lands in Shropshire and Herefordshire. He waged a guerrilla campaign that won him the nicknames Edric of the Woods and Edric the Wild. After 3-year struggle, he reportedly came to an accommodation with King William, even accompanying him on a punitive raid into Scotland. The arrangement evidently did not last, however, for the Domesday Book revealed that he had indeed lost most, if not all, of his lands. History then forgot him, but legend kept his memory alive. Medieval chroniclers claimed that, lost in the forest one night, he abducted a fairy bride, only to lose her years later when he broke a promise never to mention her supernatural origins. In later times, people insisted that he did not die, but lived on with his men in the lead mines of Shropshire, ready to ride forth at their head whenever England needed him. Another tradition even maintained that he bequeathed his sword to a great fish, which was sometimes seen in Bowmere Pool near Shrewsbury with the weapon strapped to its side. Sounds like a very ordinary life, don't you think? Let's go on to the next myth. A woman's right for justice. One famous English tale relates how it took a lady to make common cause with the people. In an age when women had little political influence, she used the only weapon available to her: her beauty. There really was a Lady Godiva, more correctly, Godifu, or gift of God. Though there is no contemporary record of the ride through the city of Coventry, for which she became famous. The earliest record of the event comes in the Chronicle of Roger of Wendover, writing more than 150 years later, who gives the date as 1057. As he told the story, Godiva was constantly pestering her husband, Earl Leofric of Mercia, to reduce the taxes on the people of Coventry, where the two had jointly founded a monastery in 1043. Tiring of her ceaseless pleading, he eventually told her he would do as she wished, but only if she would ride naked through the town's busy marketplace. No doubt he intended merely to put an end to her cajolery, but if so, he misjudged his wife, for she duly did as he required, taking care to cover her nakedness with her long flowing hair. The detail that all townsmen were ordered to stay indoors behind shutters for a ride was a later addition, as was the story that one, Peeping Tom, disobeyed and was struck blind for his effrontery. But there's at least some evidence that Coventry really did pay little tax in the early Middle Ages. An inquiry carried out in the late 13th century established that the only toll enforced there was one on horses. Do you think this myth is true or made up? I'm uncertain because of the later added details. Maybe it was just an explanation why that specific town had lower taxes than others. In our next tale, we learn about the significance about animals in medieval tales. The weasel and the baby. Bestiaries were a distinctive feature of medieval intellectual life, scanning animal behavior in search for human morals. Something of their spirit showed up in folk tales that drew emotional parallels between people and animals, as a Welsh tale about the weasel showed. The medieval fascination with animals also expressed itself in fables, a well-developed literary genre at the time. Geoffrey Chaucer included the tale of the strutting cockeriel Canticleer, lured through vanity into the fox's mouth, in his Canterbury Tales. Foxes were favorite anti-heroes of the time, starring in anime tales from across Europe. Many of the best stories found their way into a mock epic, the Roman de Renard, compiled in France in the 13th century, but bringing together folk material from a much earlier time. Much of Reynard's appeal came from his cartoon-like antics, relying on quick wits to get the better of his adversaries. Yet the compiler of the Roman framed the tales in terms of the fox's supposed trial before a council of animals, thereby setting the scene for a series of satirical digs at the society of the day. The fox's only rival for slyness was the weasel, thought at the time to be venomous. Yet, as one story from a medieval chronicle revealed, it could also show very human emotions. According to Gerald of Wales, a man found a weasel's nest inside a sheepskin in his house in Pembroke, and carefully removed it with the weasel's young still inside. When the mother returned and found her litter gone, she determined to take revenge. So she went to the jug of milk, set aside for the man's infant son, and, raising herself on her hind legs, spat poison into it. The man saw her doing so, and hurried to put the sheepskin back in its place. When the mother weasel saw that no harm had been done to her young, she squeaked with delight, then rushed back to the jug and knocked it over so that all the milk was spilled. In her gratitude at the return of her own offspring, she vowed to ensure that no harm should come to the human child. I really like this tale, how it's showing a bond between the animal kingdom and humankind. It's really fascinating to see the similarities between the East and the West when it comes to foxes. Both times they have like very, very important roles in tales and folklore. Let's go to our next tale. A faithful wife vindicated. One story of changing fortunes from Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron told of a wife's revenge on the man who had wronged her. And although it took several years to enact, it nonetheless tasted sweet when it finally came. When Bernabo of Genoa boasted of the fidelity of his wife Zenefra, his fellow merchant Ambrogio wagered him 5,000 florins that he could seduce her. For, he argued, no woman was chaste. Then he cheated to win the bet. He had himself carried into her chamber, concealed in a chest. Emerging at night when she was asleep, he was able to note enough details of the room and of her own uncovered charms to convince Bernardo that she had indeed been unfaithful. Furious, he paid up the money, then gave orders that his wife be killed. But the servant deputed to carry out the deed had not the heart for murder. Instead, he let her go. Disguised as a boy, she found her way to Egypt and took service with the Sultan, rising to a position of authority in his court. Then one day, several years later, the betrayer Ambrogio came to Egypt on a trading venture. Recognizing some former objects of hers among his merchandise, Ginevra wormed the story of his duplicity out of him. Using a stratagem to draw Bernardo from Italy, she summoned both men before the Sultan and then, under threat of torture, forced Ambrogio to reveal the truth. Bernardo was overcome with guilt, bemoaning the terrible wrong he had done his wife. At that point, Ginevra revealed her true identity, and the two were reconciled. As for the wicked Ambrogio, the Sultan sentenced him to death. Covered in honey and tied to a post in the sun, he was left to the flies and mosquitoes. I guess we have one torturous death in our medieval myths. People were really brutal back then when it came to torturing and death sentences. I saw a video once about it actually, that I couldn't finish because the torture techniques were just too gruesome for me to be honest. Imagine though, to not trusting your wife. That's so sad that her husband that her husband even wanted to kill her after supposedly cheating on him. I'm glad though that she forgave her husband and they lived happily ever after. I think at least. In our next tale we read about what happens if you scam a good bard. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. On 26 June 1284, a strange figure attired in multicolored costume approached the town fathers of Hamelin in Brunswick region and offered to solve a problem that had been troubling them, a plague of rats that infested their larders and cellars. The burghers agreed on terms with the stranger, and he proceeded to play his pipe from street to street, charming the vermin into following the music. Then he led the rats to the nearby river, where they all drowned. The council was delighted to be rid of the pests, but not so eager to pay the bill. The mysterious musician ended up cheated, so sometime later he returned to the town to take a terrible revenge. Once more he played his pipe, only this time to a different tune. Now it was the town's children that pursued him, all the way to a hill called Koppen, and there they and their leader vanished, apparently into its slopes, never to be seen again. The legend was so firmly entrenched in Hamelin by the late Middle Ages that councillors dated documents from the year of the transmigration of the children and banned musicians from their streets. Today scholars suggest that some actual incident may have become confused in the folk memory with a genuine migration out of Saxony to Hungary, or even the Children's Crusade of 1212. Then, thousands of children from Rhine Valley set out on a hopeless mission to liberate the Holy Land. Most starved to death or were sold into slavery and, like the children of Hamelin, never came home. I can remember this myth from my childhood actually. Didn't know about its origin though. The actual reason why these children vanished is so much darker than just getting abducted by a scammed musician. With that, we are at the end of our reading session. What was your favorite myth of tonight? Write me what you think. I hope you enjoyed today's reading. If you did, I would be super happy if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel. Don't be forced though, please, okay? Next week, we will be back in this cozy library to read about the Slavic East. Thanks a lot for listening. Sleep well, my little pip, and see you next time. Good night.